welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us here today on the webinar. So today, the chair and the vice chair of the Appraisal Standards Board will be summarizing the board's proposed changes to USPAP. So I'm going to ask Michelle and Nick if you would introduce yourselves real quickly, then I will do the same.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to attend this webinar. I am Michelle Chikalski-Bradley, Chair of the Appraisal Standards Board. I am a certified general appraiser and AQB certified USPAP instructor from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, practicing in the residential real property world. Just love engaging with all of you on webinars like this, so welcome.
And welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Nicholas Piltz. I am the vice chair. I am a certified general appraiser working in Orlando, Florida. I'm also AQB certified USPAP instructor. I predominantly work in the area of commercial and residential appraisal and appraisal review, as well as some consulting. Thanks,
Great,
Lisa.
thanks. Sure, thanks, Nick. So I'm Lisa Damaris. I'm the Vice President of Appraisal Issues here at the Appraisal Foundation, and I serve as the technical expert to the ASB and the AQB, and I was an appraiser in the field for 30 years prior to coming to work here full-time. Let's do what we always do really quickly, webinar logistics. Here's some quick notes I always like to run through. We are recording this webinar, and you will see the recording post to our website and our YouTube channel in less than about 24 hours. And we will be taking your questions throughout the webinar. So to ask a question, you just move your mouse to the bottom of the screen and the menu pops up. And one of the options there, this is a newer one, says Q&A. And we say it's not a bad idea to keep your chat box open, and then you can, which is located right next to the Q&A button. But if you want to post a question, please put it in the Q&A box. I know it's different than how we've done it in the past, but if you mess up and you accidentally put it in the chat box, that's okay. Just know that I'm keeping my eye on the Q&A box mostly, and I will get to the chat box as able. So try and remember to put your questions in the Q&A. At the very conclusion of the webinar, we will have a very quick and brief summary pops up on your screen, and we hope you will take a minute to fill it out. It literally just takes a minute, and the feedback we received from those always help us to continually improve our webinars. So we really appreciate you filling those out. For the agenda today, we are discussing proposed edits to the ethics rule as presented in the third exposure draft, and we will briefly review the proposed changes to other parts of USPAP from the second exposure draft. Michelle and Nick will do their best to explain the rationale for the proposed changes issued by the board. Now, one thing I want to point out about the third exposure draft, you may have, if you haven't seen the last couple issues of the exposure draft, once you have your copy on your computer, note that we have redesigned the exposure draft so it is more user-friendly. So what we have done is you can submit your comments the old way. You can always just email them to us. Or if you're in the actual exposure draft on your desktop, you will see little boxes you can click on where you can either attach a document that you have written that you want to give to the ASB, or you can just simply type your comments right there in the box and they will go directly to the ASB.
Yeah, Lisa, the new comments are really the formats are really user-friendly. So if you in the audience have never provided a comment letter, we've made it even simpler to do so, and we hope you take advantage of that. The Appraisal Standards Board issued the third exposure draft on July 26th. We have already received a lot of comments, and we are looking for your comment through September 24th. We certainly hope you don't wait that long. We hope you're so excited to send them in that you're going to do that very quickly, even sooner than that deadline. As our viewers might know, the board regularly solicits and receives comments and suggestions for improving USPAP. Proposed changes are intended to improve USPAP understanding and enforceability, and to achieve the goal of promoting and maintaining public trust in appraisal practice. It is very important to remember that although it is appraisers who comply with USPAP, others, users of appraisal services, also need to be able to understand USPAP. So here on your screen, you can see what we're going to be discussing today. Nick and I will go over the proposed changes shown in the third exposure draft in detail, and we will take as many questions as we possibly can. Please know we will do our very best to answer all of your questions. And if your question is related to how to understand what the changes mean, please rest assured that if the ASB adopts these proposed changes, we will write guidance in the form of an advisory opinion or FAQ, Q&A before any new changes become effective. So Lisa, Nick, let's jump right in and get this started.
All right, great. Michelle, the last exposure draft, which was exposure draft number 2, was issued back in December of 2021. So can you tell us a little bit about what has happened since then? It's been quite a few months that passed.
Yes, quite a few months, but a lot of work has taken place. After analyzing all of the feedback from the second exposure draft, as well as feedback from prior drafts, lots of things have taken place. And really, to best understand how we got here, how we got right here today, I need to take everyone back to a question that the ASB asked in a discussion draft from back in, I believe, May of 2021, where we asked a key question. And that key question was this: is the requirement for an appraiser to avoid relying on unsupported conclusions relating to demographic characteristics understood by appraisers and the public? Now, if I can summarize in a short word, the predominant feedback the ASB received was essentially no. This conclusion was based on comments received from 2 exposure drafts, as well as many meetings we held with advisory councils, with appraiser groups, and with federal government agencies. In other words, the ASB learned that the proposed changes to the ethics rule were not sufficient. It was not abundantly clear to the public that USPAP prohibits discrimination, and more needed to be done. Now, let me be clear. We understand that there are multiple definitions of the word discriminate. As the ethics rule deals with discrimination in the context of law, the application of this word that we are discussing is towards protected classes of people. The ethics rule in USPAP has a clear requirement that appraisers must not perform assignments with bias. And there are other standards and rules which further prohibit the appraiser from discriminating against protected classes when appraising real property. However, to some non-appraisers reading USPAP, and even to some appraisers, it was felt that the prohibitions related to discrimination were either not clear nor direct. Therefore, to address this issue and to make the prohibition against discrimination clear and conspicuous, the Appraisal Foundation, at the request of the Appraisal Standards Board, engaged the nation's foremost experts in fair housing related laws, Relman Colfax. And in direct consultation with Relman Colfax, the members of the ASB have been very hard at work for months on this third exposure draft. We are so happy it is finally here, and it is the focus of this draft is on specifically the ethics rule. Now, we will talk about other topics that are proposed for changes as well near the end of this webinar. But for now, regarding the ethics rule, the board is proposing the addition of a non-discrimination section of the ethics rule, which includes the key concepts conveyed in anti-discrimination laws that would relate to appraisal practice. In other words, the proposed revisions to the ethics rule state the concepts expressed in fair housing and fair lending laws. Now, currently, the competency rule requires the appraiser to have a recognition of and to comply with any laws and regulations that apply to the appraiser or to the assignment. This means if fair housing and other anti-discrimination laws apply, and the appraiser did not follow those laws, the appraiser would violate USPAP. Now, if these proposed changes are passed, it would be clear that if an appraiser did not follow applicable anti-discrimination laws, such as the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, at a minimum, they would not just violate the competency rule, they would also violate the ethics rule. And here is one of the key points I want to communicate to everyone today. When you look at the proposed changes, recognize that the concepts come directly from fair housing or other anti-discrimination laws. What does this mean? This means appraisers are already required to follow these newly proposed changes when they apply to the appraiser or to the assignment. These concepts should not be new to appraisers. If you are in a discipline of appraisal that is outside of residential appraisal practice, the ethics rule does apply to you. And you are required to be knowledgeable about the types of laws that could apply to your assignments. These proposed revisions apply to all disciplines. This includes business valuation, personal property, and mass valuation as well.
Thank you, Michelle, for explaining this long journey and the thought process that is behind all of this.
Yeah, it really has been quite the journey, but that's okay. That's okay, because this is really too important to focus on speed. This isn't about quick. This is about getting it right. The focus needs to be on getting the message out that while USPAP has always had a prohibition against discrimination, we recognize that this prohibition must be absolutely abundantly clear and must include specifics beyond just saying an appraiser must not discriminate. This type of work takes time. It takes consultation with experts, and the ASB soliciting and receiving feedback from you listening in the audience. We need to hear from you. As I just noted, there has been quite the evolution in how the ASB has approached this topic, from the discussion draft to the first and second exposure drafts, and now on to this third draft. We wanted this draft to be written in such a way that it places a clear spotlight on the proposed change to the ethics rule.
That makes sense. Could you now please give the listeners some background about the vision the ASB has had of the non-discrimination section?
Yes, certainly. So as it is proposed, the non-discrimination section states that any violation of applicable anti-discrimination laws is not only a violation of the competency rule, but it is also a violation of the ethics rule. And here I want to repeat something that I just mentioned a few moments ago. It's important to note that the concept presented in the non-discrimination section is not new for appraisers. Appraisers have always been required to follow applicable federal, state, and local laws as part of the competency rule. In fact, this is stated in the existing competency rule right in the being competent section. It states competency requires recognition of and compliance with laws and regulations that apply to the appraiser or to the assignment. I think I have that quote exactly. That's the key component here. You're going to hear that again a couple of times today. Laws and regulations that apply to the appraiser or to the assignment. You're going to hear Nick and me talk about that a couple of times today. We'll come back to that. The competency rule already requires the appraiser to recognize and comply with laws and regulations when they are applicable. What this new proposed section does is make it clear that not complying with applicable laws, including Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, is a violation of the ethics rule as well as the competency rule. This new section enables appraisers and anyone who reads USPAP to have a clear understanding of an appraiser's ethical and legal requirements. It also provides recognition that different laws apply in different circumstances and jurisdictions. And appraisers have an affirmative duty to know which laws apply when and when to comply, regardless of an appraiser's professional discipline.
Great. Thank you for laying out the vision of the new proposed section. Can you now tell us how the board has been working to implement this vision?
Yeah. So the board started on the plan by drafting the non-discrimination section. Now, a short summary of these proposed changes include, see on our screen, clearly stating that discrimination, which is against the law, is prohibited in appraisals. And if done by an appraiser, it is a violation of the ethics rule. Identifying the most prominent anti-discrimination laws, including the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, ECOA, and the Fair Housing Act, removing the supported, unsupported conclusions language from this rule, clarifying that conclusions and opinions based on protected characteristics are generally prohibited by law, while also recognizing that there are unique, limited exceptions. Adding language which recognizes that central federal anti-discrimination laws encompass both the concept of disparate treatment and disparate impact.
Perfect. And we can see on this slide here, this is where the proposed changes begin. So it's in the last sentence in this part of the existing ethics rule where the ASB is proposing there now be 4 sections, with that proposed new 4th section being the non-discrimination section. So can you tell us why the board decided to address this entire topic in the ethics rule and not, for example, in an advisory opinion?
Yes, well, there are several reasons. The ASB believes, after receiving stakeholder input and consulting with fair housing experts, that specific requirements related to non-discrimination needed to be expanded in USPAP itself. as opposed to just issuing further guidance on the topic and an advisory opinion. The ethics rule is the place within USPAP where ethical requirements live. And the ASB believes these changes needed to be requirements, not just advice, not just guidance. Therefore, the ASB is proposing these changes, and USPAP itself, it makes the most sense. If these changes are adopted, please rest assured that the ASB will provide detailed guidance, meaning possibly in the form of an advisory opinion, frequently asked question, some other form of communication. Public trust in the appraisal profession requires that responsible appraisers understand their obligations related to anti-discrimination, which are based on federal laws, but may also include other state or local laws, even regulations. And the public trust is protected when the public knows that appraisers are required to be aware of and comply with applicable anti-discrimination laws. This proposed new section is designed to demonstrate the ASB's steadfast commitment to the highest professional ethics. So again, if the board approves these proposed changes, the ASB will immediately begin revising guidance material so that the new material will be available when any new changes become effective. This will include revising Advisory Opinion 16, the content of which is about fair housing laws and appraisal report content. Now, before I wrap up this section, I just want to note that there are no proposed edits to the management or confidentiality sections of the ethics rule. The ASB included the entire ethics rule complete in the exposure draft. Just to give everyone a complete overall picture of the proposed rule, what it will look like if it were adopted.
Oh, Michelle, I'm sorry, but can I ask you a question now? We've just been getting so many in here.
Sure. That's what we're here for, folks. If you have
Okay.
questions, get them in the chat box. Give me a second to drink water. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So we have some questions coming in here surrounding the topic of liability. And basically, if I can summarize, I've got a couple different questions. I'm just going to try to give you the overall picture of what I think people are asking. They're asking if referencing the laws within the ethics rule will change any ethical obligations for appraisers, or basically if you feel that this will increase an appraiser's liability.
So let me start by saying it's really important to remember that these changes are proposed revisions that reflect concepts that already exist in USPAP and in anti-discrimination laws. The appraiser who conducts appraisals where fair housing laws are applicable for one reason or another has already been required to know this and follow the concepts being expressed in these edits that are being proposed to USPAP. What this new section does do is remind the appraiser of their existing obligations related to non-discrimination. This is proposed to be spelled out clearly so that there's no confusion. Appraisers are already required to be aware of and comply with these laws when applicable. I hope that clarifies that question. Okay, I think we're on the section now that we're going to turn over to the Appraisal Standard Board's Vice Chair, Nick. He's going to walk us through some of the thought process of this proposed new section.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And so as Michelle has noted, the Appraisal Standards Board wanted this message to be clear. So as we begin going through now the non-discrimination section, you can see that the proposed changes, protected characteristics from federal law as well as state and local laws, will be highlighted in the front of the non-discrimination section. The protected characteristics are right at the beginning to establish the context of these prohibitions. At the end of the phrase here, there is a catch-all phrase because it's not possible to encapsulate every protected characteristic from every jurisdiction that might be required. The proposed statement would be a clear requirement, but it is intentionally broad. This addresses what some stakeholders identified as a potential weakness in the existing ethics rule. The proposed requirement would clearly establish that the purpose of the non-discrimination section, by requiring the appraiser to not act with bias or to otherwise discriminate against or to treat differently individuals or groups based on a protected characteristic. So the explanatory comment you see here is an appropriate place to focus on real estate as opposed to personal property or business appraisal. Therefore, the comment is intentionally narrower than the proposed general requirement, which extends to all appraisal disciplines. Proposing to add a comment which is specifically about demographic characteristics in neighborhoods was chosen because of the history of neighborhood discrimination and redlining. In other words, the point is a very important one to make, given the occurrences of mortgage redlining in the United States. So moving on to laws and regulations, we wanted to focus here to be clear what the key or central laws are related to anti-discrimination by directly stating the two most important federal laws which can be applicable in many appraisal assignments. This puts appraisers on notice of important sources of legal requirements that create ethical duties. Specifically, it is the ethical duty of the appraiser to know these laws when they apply and to not violate them. This is because public trust relies on appraisers to uphold the law. This exposure draft, in other words, proposes to highlight specific laws which are already applicable to most appraisers and to many assignments. As Michelle noted earlier, the Appraisal Standards Board felt it necessary to protect public trust in appraisal practice by proposing to clarify these laws and others that prohibit discrimination in specific instances in appraisal practice.
Nick, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I have something coming in here from someone who's identified themselves as a business valuation appraiser. So
Yeah.
is it okay to ask you this? All right. So fair housing laws are outside of my realm, yet you're now making me subject to these laws since the ethics rule applies to all assignments. Can you comment on this?
Great question. So the proposed revision is stating that even if you think that these laws are outside of your realm, it is your ethical responsibility to be aware of and comply with federal, state, local laws or regulations that apply to you, the appraiser, or to your assignment. So going back to what Michelle noted earlier, the competency rule states that an appraiser must recognize and comply with the laws and regulations that apply to the appraiser or to the assignment. That's a key phrase, which is what is stated currently in the exposure draft on lines 31 through 33. So just note and recognize that it is important that anti-discrimination laws may apply in many instances in the context beyond just real property. So thank you for that question. So moving into Fair Housing Act, the Fair Housing Act is a key, the first key anti-discrimination federal law that ASB believes is necessary to highlight. So the proposed changes you see here were not written to imply that Fair Housing Act always applies, but rather is one law that appraisers need to follow when it is applicable, meaning that appraisers absolutely must comply when it does apply. Our next slide here is the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. The ECOA is relevant to appraisers even outside of real estate context because it does apply to credit transactions that do not necessarily involve real estate. So if an appraiser is involved in a credit transaction, or in the case that something will lead to a credit application being approved or denied, like an appraisal, an appraiser's conduct may be subject to ECOA. However, it is important to recognize that federal law goes beyond just mortgage lending. Please keep that in mind. Our next slide here is the comment. The comment to this section is where the concept of disparate treatment and disparate impact are noted. So these concepts are included in the comment because they identify conditions that are important to understand anti-discrimination laws. Concepts and meanings of disparate are introduced here with an explanation, although some appraisers have already requested additional guidance on these concepts. So know that if these changes are adopted, that the ASB will work to create guidance related to this topic, which might include further explaining what disparate treatment and disparate impact are, and possibly even providing some more specific examples. Those might include, the specific examples are of disparate impact and treatment were too much and too detailed to provide in the rule itself, and it's best left for guidance in that topic.
Oh,
So,
can I interrupt you again?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sorry. The questions, they seem applicable, so I'm going to ask them right now.
Yep.
So why is the ASB addressing FHA, Fair Housing Act, and ECOA, but it doesn't address other laws like Graham, Leach, Bliley?
Well, the way that USPAP references Graham, Leach, Bliley right now is in a footnote. It's in confidential information, the definition of confidential information, as well as in the ethics rule. I believe it's referenced there as well when it discusses confidential information. The ASB, the ASB noted that it came to the attention that there was a lot of confusion related to this portion of the ethics rule. Specifically, we noted a lot of comments and feedbacks around supported and unsupported conclusions. So it is in the interest of public trust to clearly state the prohibitions surrounding discrimination as it relates to the protected characteristics. And really the ASB wanted to make it abundantly clear to everyone. So, to address these concerns, it was necessary to reference the key federal laws here that apply specifically to real property appraisal assignments, and to clearly identify the types of appraisal assignments that must comply with these laws. So thanks for that question. I hope I answered it well enough there for you. What I'll do now is I'll actually turn it back over to Michelle to go over the next law.
Thanks, Nick. Folks, this is just great interaction. We love these questions coming in. We are trying to be as responsive as possible. Lisa's quickly putting all the questions into category buckets, it sounds like, and we're trying to answer as many as we can. Please don't be shy. Keep them coming in. Even if we can't get to every question during the webinar right now, your questions will help us determine what type of topics are needed for guidance. So please, 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 please continue adding them. Yes, the third key law is the Civil Rights Act of 1866, specifically sections 1981 and 1982. This act has implications on who appraisers contract with and how contracts are made, honored, or enforced. These laws are broad in their reach and are not limited to real estate. So it's really important for appraisers to be aware of them. We have discussed important federal laws relating to anti-discrimination. Federal laws are sometimes only the beginning when anti-discrimination laws are applicable, because state and local laws can have additional requirements or prohibitions beyond what the federal law requires. Because there are so many different jurisdictions that could have laws related to anti-discrimination that could apply to the appraiser or to the assignment, we can't possibly go into depth on every different state or local law, and it's really not necessary or appropriate for the ethics rule to do that. But the ASB is proposing to include this requirement. there so that appraisers recognize the need to be aware that these laws are there, and they must be followed when they are applicable. Again, appraisers have a legal and an ethical duty to know and to understand anti-discrimination laws that apply to them, and also to not perform assignments with bias. This last part makes it clear that bias and competency are ethical obligations and establish public trust.
Okay, yes, so I've been reading other questions, and I'm sorry to say there's no way we're going to get to them all, but Michelle said they will help us with this guidance later, so please put them in there. But I think I'm trying to summarize a couple of these up again. Michelle, I kind of hate to go back to another topic, but I still see some people
That's okay.
concerned about this. Okay, so this
That's
is about
okay.
the concept of liability. Since these concepts are already addressed in USPAP, why do we need more requirements? Oh, okay.
Since these concepts are already presented in USPAP, why more requirements?
Yeah.
Well, it's not more requirements. It's not more requirements. It's clarifying the existing requirements. It's not more, it's clarification. It needs to be clear to everyone to understand that this includes the public, stakeholders, appraisers. It needs to be clear for everybody. So it's not more requirements, it's a clarification of existing requirements. A main concern stakeholders had was how USPAP prohibited discrimination. It was difficult for some people to understand. This clarification makes the prohibition upfront, easy to find, easy to point to, easy to understand for everybody, not just for appraisers, but for everybody. And just to reiterate, this new section reflects existing non-discrimination laws, which the appraiser is already required to know about and to follow as part of the competency rule. This new section reminds the appraiser of their existing current obligations related to non-discrimination. There's nothing new, already existed, just being spelled out clear.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
More, you got more?
Okay, yes. How about this? So again, I'm taking several questions and
I get it.
Okay.
All good.
So the proposed rule includes references to disparate impact and disparate treatment. So how about you kind of explain what is meant by these terms?
Okay. And again, please remember that if the board does adopt, the board will work on guidance. So disparate treatment refers to treating people differently because of a protected characteristic. Generally, this refers to treatment that is overtly, intentionally different. Ill will is not required for conduct to be discriminatory. Okay, it's treating people different because of a protected characteristic. It's an easy one to remember, thinking in terms of disparate treatment. It's treating people differently because of a protected characteristic. Disparate impact. It refers to the use of neutral policies, practices that disproportionately harm a protected group, except when justified for business necessity and absent any less discriminatory alternative. Please remember that guidance will be forthcoming should the board adopt these changes.
Oh, is that anything else on that?
the only thing I would add is that further details really better addressed in training and education materials. Remember that education providers will probably, actually they already do offer courses on this and other related topics. So there is education out there now for these types of topics.
Okay. Well, we should probably move on. It's just that I think some people must be following along with their exposure draft, because I see questions coming up about proxy and coded language, and I know that's your next slide. So
yeah,
I'll just leave it to it.
Okay. Well, yeah, let's, that's great. I love the proactivity of the audience who are listening and want questions answered. So keep them coming in, and let's talk about proxy and coded language. And then maybe we'll have gotten to answered some of them up front. Okay, let's talk about the term proxy first. An appraiser must not use, rely on, or consider assumptions, stereotypes, or proxies related to protected characteristics in an analysis, opinion, or conclusion. We clearly state here a proxy is a non-protected characteristic that is intentionally used as a stand-in for a protected characteristic. The concept of proxy is also relevant for disparate impact liability. So what is a proxy? It can be thought of as something that is merely a pretext, something that appears on its face not to be a protected characteristic, but is being used in such a way that it's as though the protected characteristic itself was being used. It's a pretext. The board will have guidance on proxies, and we anticipate more questions on that topic. Now, the second topic here is about code words. The code words referenced in the proposed non-discrimination section are ones also commonly noted in lender guidelines. And these were chosen specifically because many appraisers are likely already familiar with the ones that we've identified here. For example, references to pride of ownership or crime-ridden area may be understood to have a potentially discriminatory meaning.
Michelle?
Yeah.
Michelle? Okay.
Yeah.
Interrupting again. I'm going to go back real quick.
We're here for this. Don't say interrupting. We're here for this. It's fine.
Okay. So let me go back to that concept of proxy, because some of the questions I have here.
What do you got for me?
Okay. So really, they largely are all wanting to kind of better understand why the ASB is proposing requirements related to the concept of proxy.
Well, one reason why is the topic has become very important to the public. Attorneys familiar with investigating appraisals have stated that they have found instances where code words have been used to describe neighborhood characteristics. And what this has done is it has led the public to believe that, that appraisers are not aware of the concept of proxy. Having the concept of proxy directly stated in USPAP assures the public that this is a concept appraisers are responsible for knowing.
Okay, so what exactly do you mean by proxy? I mean, you actually just kind of went over this a little bit, but I think more would help.
That's okay. So to elaborate, the word proxy, well, it captures the default manner in which race can influence decision making. This means that explaining a decision by referring to a proxy is concealing the fact that, in a very important sense, that a protected characteristic was actually being considered.
Okay. So we're on your question slide. How about I just ask, hey,
okay,
can I have a list of code words?
can I have a list of code words? Boy, that's just not possible to create a comprehensive list. And really the point is not the list itself. It's more about being aware that words may be understood to implicitly reference or indirectly signal something about the protected characteristics of what a client, a neighborhood, a resident, an owner. It's not about the list. That's not the point. It's being aware of words that may be understood to reference, signal. Code words, for example, may be used to inappropriately refer to the demographics of a neighborhood. Because of their potentially discriminatory meaning, words or phrases known to be code words should just simply be avoided. I hope that answered some of the proxy, some of the code words. Assuming that's all been in that bucket of questions, I'm going to move on to the next slide.
And Michelle, I'm interrupting you. We should probably speed up a little bit because I know we're not going to get through all this. So we must be hurried.
Okay. All right. So let's go through judgments and discretion. So because appraisals produce opinions of value, and value is a judgment about the worth of a property relative to a type of value, it's understandable that with these proposed edits, the topic of judgment and discretion would come up. Appraisers understand the judgment, understand judgment in the context of appraising and in USPAP, but the word discretion is a new word for USPAP. When someone is exercising discretion or deciding what should be done in a particular situation, there is heightened risk for bias in conclusions. Discretion may lead to actual or perceived discrimination. When an appraiser forms an opinion by discerning and comparing information, the processes that are used can lead to bias if not done objectively. Now, are there any exceptions? Can you ever rely on or use information related to protected characteristics? Yes, but it is incredibly important to note that there are very limited circumstances where information involving protected characteristics can be considered when developing an appraisal that is subject to anti-discrimination laws.
I'm just going to follow up real quick on the question I know people have what are some of these exceptions to the Fair Housing Act that you have just mentioned?
I know we're running short, but I'm glad that question came up. A really excellent example is the Fair Housing Act's prohibition against discrimination on the basis of familial status. Does not apply to housing for older persons. This is one example we're already familiar with. It is called the Housing for Older Persons Exemption. The Fair Housing Act specifically exempts certain types of housing for older persons from liability for familial status discrimination. Thank you for that question. Let's continue on to the conduct section. The ASB determined that an existing requirement in the conduct section of the ethics rule, which states an appraiser must not perform an assignment with bias. Well, it was just insufficient to communicate the breadth of USPAP's prohibition against discrimination, and in particular, additional legal concepts behind that prohibition. The ASB also determined that the current requirement related to supported and unsupported conclusions could be confusing, especially to non-appraisers, and maybe even overly broad. The existing requirement related to unsupported conclusions also made the exceptions to the Fair Housing Act more important than the current proposed revisions make them. So the new non-discrimination section states first that the use of protected characteristics in appraisal practice is prohibited, then goes on to note the existence of very limited exceptions. So this places the least emphasis on the exceptions. And we thought that was very important. So at this point, let's go ahead and turn back over to our Vice Chair, Nick. He's going to discuss some of the other topics that we still have under consideration.
Yep, thanks, Michelle. And just in the interest of time, I will try to make this quick. So going into this, I wanted to briefly talk about the second exposure draft, mainly to note that all of the proposed changes, revisions to USPAP from the second exposure draft, other than those related to the ethics rule, are still under consideration. So any of those proposed changes made may be adopted by the ASB during our next meeting, public meeting, which will be held on October 20th, 2022. While the board has received ample feedback on the proposed changes from the second exposure draft, we continue to welcome any additional comments on the topics expressed in the second exposure draft. So if you have the link to the second exposure draft is accessible by downloading the third exposure draft and following the link on the top of the fourth page there for you to link to it. So just briefly going through some of the topics just to refresh everybody's memory from what we were doing. Here on your screen, you'll see the proposed changes. We'll just go through quickly. One of them, the board proposed requiring appraisal reports to specifically include a clear disclosure on the type and extent of any inspection of a property that is subject of or in a report where the inspection was one that was performed by the appraiser as part of their scope of work. Another one would be the clarification that a sale and a transfer are essentially the same thing by adding other transfers to standards, the appropriate standards rules. The board proposed to retire the following definitions: assignment elements, misleading, personal inspection, and relevant characteristics. The board is proposing modifications to two definitions, the definition of appraiser and to work file. And lastly, the board has some minor edits which have remained as proposed in the first exposure draft. Minor edits to specific standards rules are outlined there for you. So we've had a great webinar that discusses the proposed changes that is on the Foundation's YouTube channel as well, similar to the one we're talking to you today. So please refer back to that for additional information.
Oh, great. Thank you, Michelle and Nick, for taking us through the exposure draft. And before we go and wrap this up today, I know that you have an announcement from the ASB. So Michelle, you can have the floor.
Thank you. So earlier this week, after extremely careful consideration, the Appraisal Standards Board voted to extend the current version of USPAP another year. That would make that through December 31st of 2023. Now, I just want to take a moment to explain the rationale behind that decision. As USPAP matures, proposed revisions like this take just more time to conduct the required research and ensure the changes continue to uphold the public trust. This extension is a direct result of the ASB taking its time to study and release this third exposure draft. And right now, it's not clear if these specific proposed changes will be adopted or if we will receive feedback maybe that some further work might be needed. Estates also require time to prepare for a new USPAP, and the Foundation needs time to create each new publication. So for that reason, even if the current proposed edits were adopted in October of this year at the ASB's next public meeting, the next public meeting in October of this year, it would not be possible to have the physical book ready even by midsummer of next year. I must pause here and say that I am extraordinarily proud of the work the ASB has done to develop the proposed changes to the ethics rule in this third exposure draft. And the board looks forward to receiving public comment on this proposed change.
And I just wanted to add, if I may, really quickly, that we do have a web page about the extension of USPAP. That's on our website, on the foundation's website. And if you are wondering how this extension will impact you, I suggest you look to the FAQs on that web page, as it is likely that one of your questions are answered. If not, please contact us and we will help you find an answer.
Always.
Yes, we have a ton of questions here, right? I'm sorry to say we are out of time, so we are going to keep those questions and use them for our guidance. They are very important to us. So thank you. And the chat box as well is incredibly important to us. So I am going to just move on to the "we want to hear from you" slide. Basically, what do you think? Do you have comments for us? We encourage you to comment in writing to the board before September 24th. So please click on the link in the chat box to submit your comments to the ASB, or you could always, like I said, just email us directly, asb@appraisalfoundation.org. The board is also, as always, accepting verbal comments at its virtual public meeting on October the 20th at 1 p.m. Eastern. You should see that registration link in the chat box. Thank you, Joellen. And you can always check out our events page and register for any of the upcoming meetings and webinars. So, Michelle, any last words before, or Nick, any last words before we sign off?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for sticking with us. We had a lot of very critical and important information. A lot of work went into this, and we appreciate your time. Now get to your computer and write us some comments.
Nick?
Thank you for your attendance, and thank you, Michelle. You did a great job.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And please be sure and fill out the very, very quick and brief survey that pops up as soon as this webinar ends. That allows us, again, to focus specifically on making these webinars better for you. Thank you so much for being with us, and we hope to hear from you.
Thank you.